In December of 1715, a Swedish general surveyed his dwindling army from the frigid plains of Pomerania. His forces weren't falling to enemy blades or grand defeats, but slowly vanishing, succumbing to the relentless ravages of starvation and disease, a grim testament to the encroaching demise of their once great empire. Surrounding him, a formidable alliance of Russian, Prussian, and Saxon armies, numbering over 60,000 strong, tightened their grip, closing in on his meager 8,000 men like a pack of wolves encircling cornered prey. Any other commander would have likely capitulated, seeking to negotiate honorable terms or at least salvage what remained of his command. But Axel von Fersen the Elder was no ordinary general. He embodied the very essence of the Carolinian tradition, the last staunch protector of a military heritage forged in the crucible of war by King Charles XII himself. Soon, he would deliver to Europe one ultimate, chilling demonstration of Swedish martial prowess. This is the compelling saga of a forgotten general who orchestrated Sweden's desperate last stand, a man who, armed with only his unwavering courage, strategic brilliance, and the flickering embers of a once mighty military, defied the very current of history. Welcome to this chapter of Swedish history. While towering figures such as Charles XII and Gustavus Adolphus rightfully dominate the annals, countless other Swedish commanders, equally brave and capable, have regrettably faded into obscurity. Yet, some narratives are simply too profound to be lost to time, some warriors command our lasting remembrance. Today, we delve into the extraordinary account of Axel von Fersen the Elder, a man who confronted insurmountable challenges during Sweden's most trying period and steadfastly refused to concede. Let's rewind to 1706, a year when Sweden reigned supreme, basking in the full glory of its power. The young warrior king, Charles XII, had just achieved a stunning victory at Frostad, utterly routing a Saxon army twice the size of his own. At this zenith of military might, with his Carolinian soldiers hailed as the premier fighting force across Europe, the king himself appeared unassailable. It was amidst this era of unprecedented triumph that Axel von Fersen, a 30-year-old nobleman, was entrusted with his first independent command. Unbeknownst to him, his distinguished military journey would not be etched in the victories of Sweden's golden age, but rather in the grim reality of its decline. His path would be shaped not by conquest, but by relentless survival, not by personal glory, but by unwavering defiance in the face of utter catastrophe. Axel von Fersen hailed from one of Sweden's most venerable and distinguished families. For generations, the Fersens had faithfully served Swedish monarchs, contributing a lineage of accomplished diplomats, astute administrators, and valiant soldiers. Yet, Axel possessed a distinctive path. While his kinsmen often sought political leverage and the esteemed favor of the royal court, he, by contrast, dedicated himself entirely to the intricate science of war. He meticulously absorbed every nuance of Charles XII's legendary campaigns, not viewing them as mere historical anecdotes, but as a dynamic, evolving doctrine. He committed to memory the signature Carolinian tactics, the formidable, aggressive pike formations, the earth-shattering cavalry charges, and the relentless go attack strategy that had systematically dismantled enemy armies from the plains of Poland to the heart of Saxony. Where other noblemen perceived military service as a convenient stepping stone to social advancement, Fersen regarded it as an inescapable calling, a solemn obligation to the Swedish crown and to the very military ethos that had elevated their modest nation to a dominant European power. His formative campaigns, fought under the direct command of Charles XII, would indelibly imprint upon him the harsh, unyielding arithmetic of Swedish warfare. The stark reality was that Swedish armies consistently found themselves outnumbered. Sweden's adversaries invariably commanded greater resources, more abundant manpower, and vast reserves of gold. Yet Sweden possessed a superior advantage, unparalleled training, unyielding discipline, and brilliant tactical innovation that consistently transformed theoretical disadvantages into undeniable battlefield triumphs. Fersen himself witnessed this firsthand as a force of just 8,000 Swedes decimated an 18,000-strong Saxon army at Frostad. He observed with awe as 10,000 Carolinians utterly annihilated 24,000 Russians at Narva. From these experiences, he absorbed a profound truth: Raw numbers were meaningless when pitted against precisely applied violence, and an ostensibly inferior force could decisively dominate a superior one through audacious aggression and sheer tactical brilliance. However, he also gleaned a far more somber lesson, one that would irrevocably shape the trajectory of his future career. He understood that even the most formidable army on the planet could eventually be ground down, that even the most elite soldiers would, in time, succumb to hunger, disease, and death. No amount of tactical genius could conjure sustenance, replenish lost lives, or miraculously summon reinforcements from the ether. Charles XII, despite his unparalleled ability to win every single battle, still risked losing the entire war if Sweden's finite manpower dwindled faster than it could possibly be replaced. These were not palatable notions in 1706, an era when Swedish victory seemed an absolute certainty. Nevertheless, Fersen grasped these grim realities with chilling clarity, and this profound, often solitary, understanding would become his enduring burden. By 1709, the illusion of Swedish invincibility had catastrophically shattered. Charles XII had embarked on his audacious invasion of Russia, leading 40,000 of Sweden's most elite troops into the vast, unforgiving expanse. Fersen, meanwhile, was not part of this fateful campaign. He was commanding forces in Poland, and distant observer as his king ventured ever deeper into the immense, desolate Russian wilderness. Then, the grim reports began to filter back. The Swedish army was not prevailing, it was perishing, not from enemy bullets, but from the brutal grip of the Russian winter, freezing, starving, and dying by the thousands. And then, in June of 1709, the ultimate catastrophe struck, Poltava. The Battle of Poltava witnessed the utter destruction of the once seemingly invincible Swedish army. Charles XII, wounded and defeated, was forced to flee, seeking refuge in Ottoman Turkey. The very cream of Swedish military might lay scattered and broken across the sprawling Ukrainian steppe. Fersen received this devastating news in a quiet Polish town, surrounded by his officers, who listened in stunned disbelief. The king vanquished, the legendary Carolinians shattered, it seemed an impossible reality. Yet, the undeniable evidence mounted, Russian forces were relentlessly pushing westward, and the geopolitical landscape was shifting dramatically. Denmark, seizing the moment, began preparations for a full-scale invasion. Prussia, Saxony, and Poland, indeed, every nation that Sweden had systematically humbled over the preceding decade, now detected the unmistakable scent of weakness, of blood in the water. The Swedish Empire was no longer merely imperiled, it was in an accelerating freefall, actively disintegrating. And in this maelstrom, Fersen found himself at the helm of one of the precious few Swedish forces that remained relatively intact in the field. Crucially, this was not within the safe confines of Sweden itself, where defensive bulwarks could be erected and fresh reinforcements mustered. Instead, he was in Pomerania, a Swedish-held enclave nestled in northern Germany, utterly encircled by enemies, geographically isolated from the homeland, and precariously dependent on supply lines that grew more tenuous with each passing day. His directives were brutally concise: hold Pomerania. Prevent the enemy from wresting control of Swedish Germany. Uphold Sweden's dwindling prestige and territorial integrity. Under no circumstances surrender Swedish soil. But how does one possibly retain territory with an army that has already, in essence, lost the war? How can one maintain national prestige when the king is a refugee in exile and the empire crumbles around you? These were the grim questions Fersen confronted every morning as he surveyed his diminishing forces. From 8,000 men at the dawn of 1710, his numbers dwindled to 6,000 by 1711, and a mere 4,000 by 1713. This catastrophic decline wasn't due to engagement in major pitched battles, those he meticulously avoided, but rather from the relentless, slow attrition of arduous garrison duty, incessant skirmishes, rampant disease, and widespread desertion. With each passing month, his army grew smaller, weaker, and less capable of defending the very territory he was sworn to protect. The strategic landscape was nothing short of a nightmare. To the north, Denmark, eager to reclaim territories lost to Sweden decades prior, poised for invasion. To the east, Russia advanced inexorably with colossal armies that seemed to materialize from an inexhaustible reservoir of manpower. To the south, Saxony and Poland, recalling every past humiliation at Swedish hands, sought vengeance. To the west, Prussia, maintaining a facade of careful neutrality, undeniably bided its time, awaiting the opportune moment to annex Swedish territory for its own aggrandizement. Fersen commanded a shrinking island of Swedish dominion in a vast, hostile sea of enemies, with no reinforcements on the horizon, no relief force marching to his aid, and no realistic prospect of long-term survival. Most commanders would have surely succumbed to despair, and indeed, many did. Fersen observed other Swedish generals surrendering, negotiating safe passage home, or simply abandoning their posts to preserve their own lives. He received earnest letters from fellow officers, urgently pleading with him to follow suit, to accept the harsh reality, and to salvage what little remained of Swedish military honor by averting a catastrophic final defeat. Even within his own officer corps, suggestions arose to initiate negotiations with the Russians or Saxons, urging him to accept whatever terms were currently on the table before the situation deteriorated further and more punitive conditions were imposed. Fersen's response, however, was unfailingly resolute, always the same. He would hold. He would fight. He would ensure the enemy paid a staggering price for every single inch of Swedish territory they dared to claim. This wasn't born of a deluded belief that Sweden could still miraculously win the war. He was far too astute for such fantasies. Instead, it stemmed from the profound conviction that surrender was simply inconceivable. His king had issued clear orders, and those orders remained unaltered. More fundamentally, the Carolinian tradition itself demanded uncompromising resistance. It mandated that Swedish soldiers should make their enemies pay the highest possible cost for their lives, ensuring that even in the throes of inevitable defeat, they fought with such ferocious determination that their adversaries would forever remember and respect the formidable reputation of Swedish arms. This was not naive romantic idealism. Rather, it was a meticulously calculated act of defiance. Fersen understood with chilling clarity that how Sweden ultimately lost the war held almost as much strategic consequence as the undeniable fact of the loss itself. If Swedish forces were to simply crumble without a fight, if commanders capitulated at the merest hint of enemy pressure, if the military dissolved into irrelevance in the face of superior numbers, then Sweden would be relegated to a third-rate power, ripe for bullying and exploitation by every opportunistic neighbor. Conversely, if Swedish forces fought with exceptional brilliance, even in the throes of retreat, if they inflicted disproportionate casualties upon the enemy even as they reluctantly yielded ground, if they conclusively demonstrated that conquering Swedish land exacted an absolutely terrible toll, then Sweden, though it might ultimately lose the war, could still retain sufficient respect and instill enough fear to negotiate more favorable and reasonable peace terms. With this strategic imperative in mind, Fersen undertook a radical transformation of his steadily shrinking army, forging it into an entirely new kind of fighting force. He knew he could not possibly match enemy numbers, nor could he replace his mounting losses, much less launch ambitious offensive campaigns to reclaim lost territory. What he could do, however, was perfect the intricate art of defensive warfare. He could master every conceivable tactic that allowed numerically inferior forces to relentlessly bleed their superior adversaries. He could become Europe's most accomplished practitioner of strategic delay, masterful tactical withdrawal, and uncompromising defensive combat. His first monumental step was to completely reorganize his forces. Traditional Swedish tactics, exemplified by the famous "go attack" that had secured so many victories for Charles XII, heavily emphasized aggressive offense. But such offensive strategies unequivocally demanded a numerical strength that Fersen simply did not possess. Consequently, he shifted his focus entirely, immersing himself in the study of defensive methods. He drew inspiration from a vast array of historical and contemporary sources, from the ancient Roman legions' fortifications to the most advanced principles of contemporary siege warfare. The result was a highly adaptable, mixed force comprising mobile cavalry, skillfully entrenched infantry, and easily portable artillery, a composite capable of striking decisively, and then vanishing swiftly before the enemy could possibly concentrate overwhelming force against any single position. His cavalry, once the vanguard of devastating charges, was reinvented as agile raiding parties. Instead of massing for frontal assaults, they dispersed into smaller, highly effective units that systematically harassed enemy supply lines, ambushed isolated detachments, and meticulously gathered vital intelligence on enemy movements. Fersen himself personally trained these specialized units, imbuing them with the core Carolinian techniques: rapid movement, aggressive initiative, and tactical flexibility. However, he reoriented these principles, applying them to agile, guerrilla-style operations rather than conventional open-field battles. For instance, a Swedish cavalry squadron might execute a lightning strike on a Saxon baggage train at dawn, swiftly seizing critical supplies and horses, then melting back into the dense forests before any enemy reinforcements could possibly arrive. The following day, they might reappear 30 miles away, hitting an entirely different, unsuspecting target. His infantry, too, underwent a profound transformation, learning to fortify positions with astonishing rapidity. Fersen recognized that he could not afford to hold fixed, permanent fortresses. He simply lacked the manpower to defend their walls against a sustained siege. Instead, he pioneered the creation of temporary, yet highly effective, defensive positions designed to funnel enemy assaults directly into predetermined killing zones. His soldiers became master practitioners of terrain analysis, adept at identifying natural defensive features and then augmenting them with rapidly constructed fieldworks of earth and timber. These could be erected in mere hours and, critically, abandoned without significant loss should the enemy bring overwhelming force to bear. A typical Swedish infantry company might occupy a village, quickly fortify it, hold off repeated enemy attacks for 2 or 3 days, inflicting substantial casualties, and then, under the cloak of night, stealthily withdraw to establish a new defensive posture miles away. The most innovative aspect of his reformed army was undoubtedly the artillery. Fersen could not countenance the loss of precious guns to enemy capture, so he engineered mobile artillery units capable of displacing far faster than traditional, cumbersome cannons. He deliberately traded raw firepower for paramount mobility, employing lighter guns that, while less potent in sustained bombardment, could be moved with incredible swiftness and still deliver devastating short-range fire. These nimble weapons would be deployed at crucial junctures, providing vital support to infantry defensive positions, expertly covering tactical withdrawals, and effectively disrupting enemy assault formations. Then, just as swiftly, they would limber up and relocate, before enemy counter-battery fire could zero in and destroy them. What Fersen had masterfully engineered was, in essence, a proto-modern defensive force. His objective was never to permanently hold ground. Instead, it was to ensure that every single enemy advance came at an exorbitant cost. His strategy was to judiciously trade space for precious time, to systematically bleed enemy armies dry while meticulously preserving his own dwindling force. He understood that when outright victory in battle is unattainable, one must fundamentally redefine what victory entails. For Fersen, victory manifested in surviving another week, inflicting another 50 casualties, or compelling the enemy to commit an additional 1,000 soldiers merely to pursue a few hundred elusive Swedes. The Russians were the first to experience the brutal expense of this new form of warfare. In the summer of 1713, a formidable Russian force, numbering approximately 12,000 soldiers, advanced into Pomerania with the specific aim of capturing the pivotal fortress of Stralsund. Standard Russian tactics heavily emphasized massed infantry assaults, the belief that by hurling sufficient numbers of soldiers at a position, it would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer numerical superiority. Against well-established, fixed fortifications, these tactics, while undeniably costly, had often proven effective. However, when pitted against Fersen's fluid, mobile defense, they proved utterly disastrous. The Russian commander had fully anticipated encountering Swedish forces staunchly defending Stralsund's approaches. Instead, he found only desolate roads, deserted villages, and a complete absence of any visible, organized resistance. Perplexed and frustrated, the Russian commander pushed deeper into Swedish territory, widely dispersing his forces in a futile attempt to occupy a broader area and pinpoint the elusive Swedish army. This, precisely, was the trap Fersen had meticulously laid. The moment the Russian force fragmented, the Swedish cavalry, now operating as relentless raiders, sprang into action. Over a period of 3 harrowing weeks, Swedish detachments ceaselessly assailed the Russians. Baggage trains were ambushed and plundered, foraging parties were systematically destroyed, and isolated detachments were attacked and annihilated with chilling efficiency. The Russians never once engaged in a major pitched battle. They simply couldn't locate the main Swedish force. Yet they bled continuously from 1,000 small, debilitating cuts. When the Russian commander eventually recalled his scattered units and finally managed to concentrate them for what he hoped would be a decisive offensive, he was forced to tally his grim losses. Nearly 800 men were dead or missing, his supply situation was critical, morale lay shattered, and the main Swedish force remained maddeningly unlocated, yet perfectly intact, and still fully capable of launching further operations. This became Fersen's indelible signature method: to meticulously avoid pitched battle when the enemy concentrated their strength, and to strike relentlessly when they dispersed. It was a strategy of trading territory for attrition, designed to make every enemy advance so costly that opposing commanders would inevitably hesitate, delay, and ultimately question whether continuing their offensive was truly worth the mounting casualties. It was not a glorious form of warfare. It certainly didn't yield the dramatic, decisive victories that had once immortalized Swedish arms. But it worked. By 1714, Fersen's army had dwindled to roughly 5,000 effective soldiers. Yet, these 5,000 had arguably become the finest defensive force in all of Europe. They had engaged in dozens of skirmishes and engagements against Russian, Saxon, and Polish forces. They had lost territory, slowly, grudgingly, but inevitably. Crucially, however, they remained intact, meticulously organized, and undeniably dangerous. Enemy commanders respected them, feared them, and maneuvered with extreme caution to avoid the devastating ambushes and sudden, unpredictable attacks that had become the hallmark of Swedish operations. Then came the seismic news that fundamentally altered everything. Charles XII, the formidable warrior king, was returning from his 5-year exile in Ottoman Turkey, determined to personally lead Sweden's defense once more. For Fersen, this announcement was simultaneously a source of profound hope and deep dread. Hopeful, because Charles XI's legendary strategic genius might yet conceive a way to salvage their desperate predicament. Terrifying, because the king's unyielding, aggressive temperament would never countenance the cautious, defensive warfare Fersen had so painstakingly perfected. Charles XII did not believe in trading space for time. He attacked, always attacked, relentlessly seeking decisive battle regardless of the overwhelming odds. The king finally arrived in Pomerania in November 1714. Fersen met him at Stralsund, the last substantial Swedish fortress remaining in Germany. What transpired was a tense, pivotal interview that laid bare the profound chasm between abstract strategic vision and the harsh realities of tactical exigency. Charles XII listened intently to Fersen's detailed report on the military situation, the drastically shrinking army, the multitude of encircling enemy forces, the dire and increasingly desperate supply situation. Then, without hesitation, he issued his unwavering orders: prepare for offensive operations. Gather the scattered Swedish forces. Plan a major campaign to completely drive the Russians and Saxons out of Pomerania. Fersen, with utmost deference, attempted to articulate precisely why such an undertaking was utterly impossible. The army, he explained, simply lacked the numerical strength for sustained offensive operations. The enemy enjoyed an overwhelming numerical superiority that would render any major battle an unacceptable risk, almost certainly destroying the last intact Swedish field force in Germany. He argued that it would be far wiser to persist with the proven defensive strategy, to meticulously preserve Swedish forces while making every enemy advance excruciatingly costly, and to husband their dwindling resources for eventual, more favorable peace negotiations. Charles XI's response was that of a pure warrior king, uncompromising and absolute. Defensive operations, he declared, were nothing less than admissions of weakness. Swedish armies attacked. Carolinians did not cower in forests, ambushing baggage trains. They formed imposing battle lines and decisively crushed enemy armies in open combat. The king had returned to restore Sweden's military honor, not to supervise a slow, ignominious retreat into oblivion. Fersen, he made clear, would prepare his forces for battle, or he would be swiftly replaced by someone who would. What choice did Fersen have? He was a soldier, bound by sacred oath and unyielding honor to obey his king's commands. Moreover, he deeply believed in the fundamental tenets of the Carolinian tradition, even if he gravely suspected the king was misapplying them to their current, catastrophic situation. So, with a heavy heart, he prepared his forces for offensive operations, diligently gathering his scattered units and concentrating them around Stralsund, readying them for the inevitable battle Charles XII so imperiously demanded. The Russians, in turn, readily obliged. In early 1715, they brought up a massive siege force, numbering over 40,000 soldiers, supported by hundreds of cannons, and supplied by an endless stream of resources drawn from Russia's immense reserves. Against this overwhelming host, Fersen commanded barely 6,000 men confined within Stralsund's walls. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear: the city would fall. The only remaining question was how long it could possibly hold out, and how many Russians would perish in its eventual taking. Charles Xi's strategy, as always, was characteristically aggressive. Instead of passively defending Stralsund's formidable walls, Finn conceived a bold strategy to launch repeated, aggressive sorties that would directly assault Russian siege works and disrupt their carefully planned operations. He intended to lead these daring attacks personally, leveraging the renowned Swedish tactical superiority to inflict maximum possible casualties upon the besieging forces. Finn reasoned that if these sorties proved sufficiently successful, if the Russians were to suffer heavy enough losses, their morale might break, compelling them to abandon the costly siege entirely. This was a straightforward, yet audacious, gamble, pitting Swedish tactical skill against overwhelming Russian numerical superiority, and Caroline aggression against superior firepower. It represented the traditional Swedish way of warfare, a method that had previously secured victories at battles like Narva and Fredat, along with a dozen other engagements. However, those past triumphs had been achieved by strong Swedish armies against surprised adversaries. This was a far grimmer scenario, a desperate garrison battling from a fortress already deemed doomed, facing an enemy thoroughly prepared for resistance. Finn personally spearheaded the very first sortie. 2,000 Swedish soldiers executed a pre-dawn attack against the Russian siege lines. The precision and timing were flawless. Swedish forces crashed into Russian positions before the bewildered defenders could properly react, systematically destroying artillery emplacements, killing hundreds of Russian soldiers, and then expertly withdrawing before Russian reinforcements could converge and trap them against their own fortifications. It was a tactical masterpiece that inflicted over 600 Russian casualties, while the Swedes suffered fewer than 80 losses. The second sortie, unfortunately, did not fare as well. The Russians, having learned from the initial shock, had significantly reinforced their siege works and established more robust defensive positions. While Swedish forces still managed to break through, and Caroline aggression remained a formidable factor, the subsequent withdrawal quickly devolved into chaos. Russian cavalry launched a vigorous pursuit, transforming what was intended to be an orderly retreat into a desperate, running fight for survival. Swedish losses climbed to nearly 200 men, while Russian casualties were approximately 400. Though still a favorable casualty ratio, such losses were simply unsustainable for a garrison numbering only 6,000. The third sortie proved to be an unmitigated disaster. Russian forces had meticulously prepared specific kill zones, strategically designed to funnel Swedish attacks directly into concentrated, massed artillery fire. When Finn valiantly led his troops forward, they marched straight into a devastating storm of grapeshot that utterly shredded their formations, transforming tactical brilliance into a scene of mass slaughter. Out of 1,500 Swedish soldiers who participated in the sortie, barely 900 managed to make it back to Stralsund's battered walls. Russian losses, by contrast, were minimal, perhaps only around 100 casualties. The mathematical equation had starkly reversed. Sweden could no longer afford to trade lives favorably. Finn was forced to confront Charles with this brutal arithmetic. Each successive sortie weakened the Swedish garrison faster than it weakened the Russian siege. At the current, alarming attrition rates, Stralsund would inevitably fall, not from a direct Russian assault, but from the gradual, inexorable erosion of its dwindling defender force. Finn unequivocally argued that they needed to immediately abandon the aggressive offensive strategy, conserve their remaining, precious troops, and instead focus entirely on pure defense until relief forces could arrive or, failing that, honorable terms for surrender could be successfully negotiated. However, Charles XII resolutely refused to accept such a pragmatic counsel. He declared that Swedish soldiers would attack, for Carolinians did not cower behind walls. He firmly believed that just one more sortie, properly conceived and executed, would shatter Russian morale and ultimately force them to lift the siege. He insisted that Finn would lead this final, decisive attack personally, employing every ingenious trick of Swedish tactics to finally achieve the breakthrough result that had eluded all previous attempts. What does a man do when his king, the warrior he has loyally followed for years, the tactical genius who forged the very military tradition he has dedicated his life to mastering, orders him to lead what he instinctively knows is a suicide mission? Axel von Fersen wrestled with this profound question throughout a long, sleepless night. He could choose to refuse, thereby accepting the inevitable court-martial and the crushing disgrace that would surely follow. He could obey half-heartedly, leading the sortie with minimum commitment, perhaps preserving more of his men's lives, but at the cost of guaranteeing certain failure. Or, he could choose to obey fully, committing absolutely everything to one final, desperate Caroline assault, and trust against all odds that Swedish tactical superiority might still somehow achieve the miracle the king so stubbornly demanded. He ultimately chose the last option, not because he genuinely believed it would succeed, but because belief itself didn't matter in this context. He was a Swedish general. Charles XII had issued an order, and Caroline tradition demanded absolute, unyielding commitment, regardless of the odds. If they were destined to fail, and Finn was almost certain they were, then they would fail gloriously, demonstrating one last time the true essence of Swedish military excellence. The fourth sortie launched at dawn on a cold February morning. Finn led 1,800 men, representing nearly a third of Stralsund's entire remaining garrison, in what was intended to be a decisive, knockout strike against the Russian siege lines. The plan itself was exceptionally sophisticated and multi-pronged, meticulously designed to overwhelm Russian defenders through simultaneous attacks on several critical positions. Swedish forces moved with incredible precision, timing their assaults perfectly, hitting Russian fortifications from entirely unexpected angles. For the first crucial hour, the plan worked spectacularly. Swedish troops shattered Russian defensive positions, swiftly captured artillery pieces, and drove deep into enemy territory. Watching from Stralsund's walls, Charles XII must have felt profoundly vindicated. This, he would have believed, was precisely what Caroline warfare looked like when executed flawlessly: inferior numbers, yet superior tactics, Swedish aggression, breaking enemy formations despite overwhelming odds. Then, abruptly, the Russian trap was sprung. The positions they had abandoned with such seeming ease were, in fact, an elaborate bait, designed to draw Swedish forces far away from Stralsund's protective walls. Once the Swedes had fully committed to their attack, Russian forces launched a devastating counterattack from carefully prepared positions on both flanks. Suddenly, Fersen's 1,800 men were no longer assaulting a siege line. They were completely surrounded by thousands of Russian soldiers, supported by artillery, with absolutely nowhere to retreat. What followed was the kind of desperate, close-quarters combat that truly defined Swedish military excellence. Finn's troops immediately formed impenetrable defensive squares, using their superior training and discipline to hold off relentless Russian assaults, and began the brutal process of fighting their way back towards Stralsund's gates. Every single yard gained was purchased with blood. Swedish soldiers died in neat ranks, astonishingly maintaining their formation discipline even as Russian firepower tore through their lines. Officers fell, valiantly leading desperate counterattacks to buy precious time for their men to withdraw. The retreat became a running battle that raged for 6 arduous hours. Of the 1,800 Swedish soldiers who bravely participated in the sortie, barely 800 managed to make it back within Stralsund's walls. Russian losses were indeed heavier, as Carolinians never died cheaply, but the strategic outcome for the Swedes was utterly catastrophic. Fersen had lost over half of his assault force, weakening Stralsund's garrison to the perilous point where any further offensive sorties were rendered impossible, and he had, in strategic terms, gained exactly nothing. The relentless Russian siege continued unabated. It was now clear that the walls would eventually fall. The final sortie had failed. Charles XII's response was entirely characteristic of his unwavering resolve. He blamed the execution, not the strategy. In his view, the sortie had been properly conceived, but poorly executed. He maintained that with better tactical leadership, with a more aggressive commitment from subordinate officers, and with the kind of all-out, unyielding assault that had secured victories at Narva and Fredat, it would undoubtedly have succeeded. Fersen and his officers, Charles asserted, had been too cautious, too focused on preserving their men's lives rather than single-mindedly achieving decisive victory. Fersen, knowing the futility of it, did not argue. Arguing with the king achieved precisely nothing. Instead, he pragmatically focused his efforts on Stralsund's immediate defense, meticulously preparing the city for the inevitable Russian assault. With less than 3,000 effective soldiers remaining, holding the city's extensive fortifications against a superior enemy was now nearly impossible. Yet, nearly impossible had, over time, become Fersen's particular specialty. He ingeniously reorganized the diminished garrison into highly mobile reserves, capable of swiftly rushing to any threatened points along the extensive perimeter. He meticulously prepared fallback positions within the city itself, ensuring that even if the Russians managed to breach the outer walls, they would face continued, determined resistance. He also rigorously rationed all available supplies to extend the siege as long as humanly possible. The main Russian assault finally came in early December 1715. It began with a massive, thunderous artillery bombardment, immediately followed by overwhelming infantry assaults launched at multiple points simultaneously along Stralsund's beleaguered defenses. Fersen's mobile reserves, expertly commanded, rushed from one crisis point to another, plugging critical gaps in the walls, furiously counterattacking Russian penetrations, and desperately buying time with their very lives. For 3 grueling days, the vastly outnumbered Swedish garrison held their seemingly impossible positions against an overwhelming enemy force. On the 4th day, however, Russian forces broke through in strength, not at a single point that could be contained, but at multiple locations simultaneously. Fersen's reserves, no matter how skillfully deployed, simply couldn't be everywhere at once. Swedish defensive positions collapsed in a tragic sequence, like falling dominoes. By nightfall, Russian forces had seized control of half of Stralsund. Even then, Charles XII defiantly ordered continued resistance. Every street, every building, he commanded, would be defended to the last man. The Russians would pay a heavy price for every single inch of Swedish territory. Fersen was to lead these urban combat operations, transforming Stralsund into a deadly trap for the invaders. But Fersen had finally reached his limit. He had truly had enough. He had faithfully followed impossible orders, led doomed sorties, and watched his brave men die for a defensive position that was, from the outset, always going to fall. He had done everything his king demanded, and more. Now, he was being ordered to utterly destroy what little remained of his command in brutal, house-to-house fighting that would accomplish nothing beyond racking up even higher casualty counts. For the very first time in his illustrious career, Axel von Fersen genuinely considered disobeying his king's direct command. He gathered his surviving officers for a clandestine midnight council. The situation, they all agreed, was utterly hopeless. Continued resistance would only result in their collective deaths without achieving any conceivable strategic objective. The truly honorable course of action, they concluded, was to negotiate surrender terms that would preserve the lives of their men and allow them the chance to fight again in defense of Sweden proper, rather than dying uselessly in a German city that was, to all intents and purposes, already lost. His officers agreed unanimously. They resolved to approach Charles XII together, presenting a united front and formally requesting permission to negotiate a surrender. The king, they reasoned, couldn't possibly execute all of them. And even if he could, even if this meant a court-martial and the ultimate disgrace, it was undeniably the right decision. The true Caroline tradition, they now understood, wasn't about suicidal sacrifice. It was about fighting brilliantly, not dying stupidly. They never got the opportunity to make their case. That same night, Charles XII, independently, made his own momentous decision. Stralsund, he conceded, was lost. Continuing the feudal defense would merely squander Sweden's last field force remaining in Germany. He would instead evacuate what remained of the garrison, escape to Sweden proper, and continue the war from there. Fersen was consequently tasked with overseeing this critical evacuation, getting as many men as possible onto ships before the Russians could completely tighten their overwhelming grip. The evacuation itself proved to be Fersen's final masterpiece of the Pomeranian campaign. Utilizing the cover of darkness and employing masterful misdirection, he successfully withdrew Swedish forces from their defensive positions without the Russians ever realizing what was happening. By dawn, when Russian commanders launched their anticipated final assault, they discovered only abandoned positions and empty streets. The Swedish garrison had vanished, having embarked onto ships that were already sailing swiftly across the Baltic towards the safety of Sweden. Of the 6,000 soldiers who had initially defended Stralsund, barely 2,500 made it back to Sweden. The rest were dead, captured, or dispersed. Swedish Pomerania was irrevocably lost. The last major Swedish territory in Germany had fallen. The evacuation itself, brilliantly executed though it was, thus represented a strategic catastrophe of immense proportions. However, Fersen had, through his skill and determination, saved 2,500 veteran soldiers who would otherwise have perished in Stralsund's streets. He had preserved a trained, experienced fighting force that Sweden desperately needed for its homeland defense. He conclusively demonstrated that even in defeat, Swedish military competence remained formidable, and he bought invaluable time, months of defensive operations that significantly delayed enemy advances and allowed Sweden to strengthen its defensive positions in the homeland. The war, relentlessly, continued. Charles XII launched new, increasingly desperate campaigns, forever seeking the decisive victory that always seemed to remain just tantalizingly out of his reach. Fersen, for his part, commanded increasingly desperate defensive operations, expertly using every trick and lesson he had learned in Pomerania to make enemy advances as costly as possible. In 1716, he skillfully defeated a Russian landing attempt on the Swedish coast, employing mobile forces to destroy enemy beachheads before they could consolidate. In 1717, he commanded the tenacious defense of western Sweden against the Norwegian invasion, once again demonstrating his profound mastery of defensive warfare by holding superior enemy forces with only minimal troops. Then, in November 1718, came the news that utterly shocked everyone: Charles XII was dead. He had been tragically killed by a bullet during the siege of Fredrikstad in Norway. The legendary warrior king who had defined Swedish military glory, who had won impossible victories and stubbornly refused to accept defeat, who had led Sweden first to greatness and then ultimately to ruin, was gone. And with his passing went the very last, lingering hope of military victory for Sweden. Fersen received the somber news while commanding forces in western Sweden. His immediate thought was not about military strategy or tactical implications. It was simpler, more profoundly human. The king is dead, and we can finally stop fighting impossible battles. Charles XII's death meant that Sweden could, at last, negotiate a peace without dishonoring a monarch who had steadfastly refused to compromise. It meant a long overdue recognition of military reality, an acceptance that Sweden had indeed lost the Great Northern War, and hopefully, a settlement on terms that would preserve Sweden's core territory, even if its vast empire was now irretrievably lost. The peace negotiations dragged on for years. During that protracted period, Fersen continued to command Swedish defensive forces, maintaining military pressure where possible, and demonstrating continued capability even as everyone knew that the war was effectively over. He fought his very last battle in 1719, a minor skirmish against Russian raiders that perfectly encapsulated his entire distinguished career, outnumbered Swedish forces using superior tactics to inflict disproportionate casualties, and then skillfully withdrawing before the enemy could bring up overwhelming force. The Treaty of Nystad, signed in 1721, officially brought the Great Northern War to an end. Sweden lost Pomerania, lost the Baltic provinces, and tragically lost its status as a great European power. But crucially, it retained its core territory, maintained its independence, and emerged from catastrophic defeat with enough inherent strength to remain a respected regional power. Much of this remarkable resilience was undeniably due to brilliant commanders like Fersen, who had fought skillfully enough even in defeat to preserve Swedish military credibility and essential negotiating leverage. Fersen retired from active military service in 1722. He was 46 years old and had spent his entire adult life consumed by war. Unlike Charles XII, who had tragically died in battle, never knowing peace, Fersen lived to witness Sweden stabilize, rebuild, and painstakingly adapt to its significantly reduced circumstances. He never achieved the dramatic glory of the great Swedish victories. He never led vast armies to crushing triumphs over vastly inferior foes. Instead, he had mastered the far harder art of fighting exceptionally well while losing, of preserving precious forces in the face of overwhelming odds, and of maintaining honor and professional competence even when outright victory was an impossible dream. History, for the most part, largely overlooked Axel von Fersen the Elder. His campaigns simply weren't dramatic or glamorous enough for popular memory. He didn't win glorious battles that could be celebrated in heroic paintings and epic poems. He fought defensive actions, skillfully executed retreats, and daring evacuations, the unglamorous, often brutal, necessity of war rather than its heroic ideal. Even his family's later fame stemmed more from his son, Axel von Fersen the Younger, whose romantic involvement with Marie Antoinette made him far more renowned than his father's impressive military achievements ever did. But military historians who meticulously study the art of defensive warfare, who carefully analyze precisely how inferior forces can effectively resist superior ones, who examine the intricate mechanics of strategic delay and tactical brilliance under the most desperate circumstances, these experts unequivocally know Fersen's name. They study his Pomeranian campaigns as masterpieces in mobile defense. They analyze his daring evacuation of Stralsund as a textbook example of a successful withdrawal under intense pressure. They recognize him as one of the finest commanders of his era, a general who profoundly understood that sometimes the greatest victory is simply surviving to fight another day. Fersen's enduring legacy lies not in what he ultimately won, but in what he assiduously preserved. He preserved vital Swedish military traditions during a turbulent era when they could easily have been utterly lost in catastrophic defeat. He preserved the lives of countless soldiers when other commanders carelessly threw them away in futile last stands. He preserved enough Swedish military capability that the nation could negotiate reasonable peace terms rather than facing complete subjugation. And he preserved the crucial idea that Swedish arms, even in defeat, remained formidable and eminently worthy of respect. The Caroline era officially ended with Charles XII's death in 1718. But the true Caroline spirit, that unique combination of tactical excellence, aggressive initiative, and an unyielding refusal to surrender regardless of the odds, survived in commanders like Fersen. He adapted it, transforming its emphasis from offensive glory to defensive necessity, but he kept it powerfully alive when it could so easily have died with the king at Fredrikstad. Later, future Swedish commanders would meticulously study his campaigns, learning invaluable lessons from his methods, and expertly applying his principles to new and unforeseen challenges. Consider what Fersen accomplished within the context of his truly impossible situation. He commanded forces that were perpetually outnumbered, consistently undersupplied, and always fighting from positions of profound strategic disadvantage. He served a king whose brilliant tactical instincts were tragically paired with catastrophically poor strategic judgment. He faced enemies who enjoyed every conceivable material advantage, while he himself struggled merely to feed his own troops. And yet, across years of continuous, brutal warfare, he steadfastly maintained an effective fighting force, inflicted significant casualties on numerically superior enemies, and preserved Sweden's military capability when it could so easily have collapsed entirely. This, precisely, is the true essence of military excellence, not just winning when circumstances inherently favor victory, but fighting brilliantly when they favor defeat. True leadership isn't about presiding over easy victories. Anyone can command effectively when blessed with overwhelming numbers and boundless resources. The real measure of a general's skill emerges when they are severely outnumbered, outgunned, and universally expected to lose. It is in these dire circumstances that tactical brilliance becomes paramount, where every single decision holds immense consequence, and where the thin line between merely competent and truly brilliant command dictates the very outcome of survival or utter annihilation. Finn excelled in this demanding crucible. He elevated defensive warfare to an art form, pioneering tactics that would later be studied and widely emulated by subsequent commanders. He unequivocally proved that Swedish military prowess wasn't contingent on favorable conditions or numerical superiority. Instead, it was deeply embedded in exceptional training, adaptive tactical flexibility, and a resolute competence that compelled even adversaries to respect Swedish arms, even in their moments of defeat. This extraordinary man passed away in 1740, almost 2 decades after the cessation of the Great Northern War. He lived long enough to witness Sweden's transition to peace, to observe a new generation mature free from the relentless warfare that had characterized his entire existence. His death was peaceful and unassuming, devoid of the dramatic battlefield and often associated with the last great Carolean. He was simply an old soldier, dying quietly, remembered by his comrades in arms but largely overlooked by the annals of history. Yet, his story holds profound significance. It matters because it illuminates a form of heroism distinct from the glorious victories we typically celebrate. Fersen's heroism was defined by unwavering duty in the face of despair, by fighting brilliantly even when the struggle seemed utterly futile, and by meticulously preserving what could be saved when all appeared lost. It represents the heroism of the rearguard, of the desperate last stand that buys precious time for others to escape, of the commander who leads not for personal glory but out of stark necessity. It matters because it powerfully demonstrates that tactical brilliance is not confined to ideal circumstances. Finn never commanded the robust, well-supplied armies that secured Sweden's earlier triumphs. Instead, he led desperate forces in seemingly impossible situations, and through his unparalleled skill, he rendered them far more effective than they had any reasonable right to be. This offers invaluable wisdom for any military challenge. Work with the resources at hand, relentlessly maximize every advantage, no matter how minor, and absolutely refuse to let material disadvantages become an excuse for subpar performance. Furthermore, his story is important because it reveals the grim true cost of war, particularly prolonged conflict against superior adversaries. The Great Northern War shattered Sweden's empire and claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Swedish soldiers. Charles XII's aggressive strategy yielded tactical victories that ultimately amounted to nothing strategically, relentlessly depleting Sweden's limited manpower in pursuit of decisive battles that never quite brought the war to a definitive end. Finn deeply understood this tragic waste. He strove to minimize it, preserving as many lives as possible, even when directly ordered to squander them. His career serves as a potent reminder that military glory often comes at an horrific human cost, and that the generals who prioritize and preserve their soldiers' lives are sometimes far wiser than those who expend them without hesitation. And it matters profoundly because forgotten heroes warrant our remembrance. History tends to glorify the dramatic victories, the stunning triumphs, and those rare moments when every element aligns perfectly. Yet, the reality of war largely comprises excruciatingly difficult situations where very little goes right, where commanders are forced to choose the best among truly terrible options, and where success often means merely losing slowly instead of rapidly. Finn demonstrated exceptional mastery of this unglamorous reality. He merits recognition not in spite of conducting defensive campaigns rather than glorious offensives, but precisely because achieving defensive excellence under the most desperate circumstances represents the pinnacle of military skill. Let us consider the specific tactical innovations Finn meticulously developed during his Pomeranian campaigns. Traditional Swedish warfare historically relied upon brutal shock tactics, massive pike formations advancing unflinchingly under enemy fire to engage in close combat, immediately followed by devastating cavalry charges designed to shatter enemy lines. This approach inherently demanded numerical superiority, allowing for the absorption of significant casualties during the approach and the maintenance of formation integrity throughout the assault. However, Finn simply could not bear such casualties. Every fallen soldier was irreplaceable. Consequently, he devised alternative methodologies that achieved comparable tactical outcomes with significantly fewer losses. His infantry formations were transformed, becoming notably smaller and far more flexible. Moving away from the colossal pike squares that had once dominated European battlefields, Fersen instead deployed company-sized units, each capable of independent maneuver. Crucially, each of these versatile units integrated pikemen for close-quarters combat, musketeers for essential firepower, and grenadiers for aggressive assault operations. These innovative mixed formations possessed the inherent ability to rapidly adapt to evolving tactical situations on the fly, without needing to constantly wait for explicit orders from higher command. For instance, a Swedish company might commence a battle in a solid defensive formation, then fluidly transition into mobile skirmishing if the enemy advanced with caution, only to swiftly reform for a decisive counterattack should a favorable opportunity arise. This unprecedented level of tactical flexibility, however, necessitated extraordinarily intensive training. Swedish soldiers serving under Finn's command drilled incessantly, perfecting swift transitions between various formations, meticulously learning to interpret complex battlefield situations and adapt their actions accordingly. This rigorous regimen fostered the critical tactical judgment that empowered them to operate with such remarkable independence. While other armies remained heavily reliant on officers to direct virtually every movement, Fersen's seasoned troops could continue to fight effectively even when casualties among their officers severely disrupted the command structure. This wasn't merely a testament to superior training. It was a grim necessity for survival for forces that simply could not afford to collapse in cohesion when their leaders fell. His cavalry tactics proved to be even more revolutionary. Traditional cavalry doctrine invariably stressed the importance of mass charges, hundreds of horsemen thundering across the battlefield in tightly packed formations, aiming to smash into enemy lines with overwhelming, concentrated force. Such spectacles were undoubtedly thrilling to witness and devastatingly effective when executed flawlessly, but they were also catastrophically expensive when things went awry. A single failed cavalry charge could result in the loss of hundreds of irreplaceable troopers in mere minutes. Finn, unable to countenance such exorbitant risks, transformed his cavalry into swift raiders rather than conventional shock troops. He meticulously organized them into small, agile squadrons of 30 to 50 horsemen, rigorously training them in rapid movement and aggressive initiative, before unleashing them against the enemy's vital logistics rather than engaging directly with their main armies. A typical Swedish cavalry squadron, for instance, might undertake a grueling 50-mile ride overnight, launch a devastating strike on an enemy-supplied depot at dawn, seize vital food and ammunition, incinerate anything they couldn't carry, and then completely vanish before any enemy reinforcements could possibly arrive. The very next night, they would invariably be hitting a completely different target, approaching from an unexpected direction. This highly dispersed cavalry warfare drove enemy commanders to absolute distraction. They could never anticipate where the elusive Swedish horsemen would strike next. Protecting crucial supply lines demanded the dedication of thousands of soldiers to tedious garrison duty, troops who otherwise could have been fighting decisively on the front lines. Furthermore, foraging became an incredibly perilous undertaking. Russian or Saxon supply parties now required heavily armed escorts, significantly slowing their operations and consuming precious resources. The relentless, constant raids fostered deep paranoia and widespread fear, systematically degrading enemy morale even when they weren't directly engaged in active combat. Perhaps Finn's most technically sophisticated innovations were in artillery. Traditional artillery pieces were, in essence, completely immobile once a battle commenced. Cannons were inherently heavy, demanded extensive crews to operate them effectively, and were utterly incapable of rapid relocation. Artillery commanders would select their positions prior to battle, establish their firing points, and then remain fixed there, entirely regardless of how the engagement subsequently developed. While certainly effective for static long-range bombardment, this rigidity proved utterly disastrous if the tactical situation evolved and the heavy guns were unable to adapt. Fersen brilliantly resolved this critical shortcoming through what we would now term a mobile artillery doctrine. He systematically reduced gun calibers, intentionally sacrificing some range and hitting power in favor of significant weight reduction. His resulting lighter cannons could be maneuvered by smaller crews, rapidly relocated even in the midst of battle, and swiftly withdrawn if enemy pressure grew too intense. This innovative approach meant that Swedish artillery could deploy quickly, unleash devastating short-range salvos into enemy formations, then rapidly limber up and displace before enemy counter-battery fire could zero in and destroy them. This transformed artillery from static bombardment tools into dynamic, mobile fire support, profoundly enhancing the flexibility of Swedish tactical options. Moreover, the logistics system underpinning these operations was equally inventive. With supply lines stretching precariously thin from distant Sweden, Fersen simply could not depend on conventional supply methods. Consequently, he pioneered a system of decentralized logistics, where individual units were made responsible for their own sustainment. While this might sound inherently chaotic, and indeed, it initially presented challenges, it aligned perfectly with his dispersed operational approach. For instance, if a cavalry squadron was actively raiding enemy territory, it could effectively live off captured supplies, rather than being tethered to vulnerable wagon trains from distant depots. Similarly, if an infantry company occupied a village, it possessed the authority to commandeer local food and resources, rather than passively waiting for centrally issued rations to arrive. This decentralized approach, however, demanded extraordinarily strict discipline to prevent abusive foraging that would inevitably alienate local populations. Finn implemented harsh penalties for any unauthorized plunder, mandated that units pay for supplies whenever feasible, and personally investigated complaints regarding Swedish troop misconduct. He deeply understood that living off the land would only be sustainable if the local populace tolerated the Swedish presence. If they were turned hostile, every single village would transform into a potential ambush site, and every peasant a potential informant for enemy forces. The intelligence-gathering operations Finn meticulously established were equally sophisticated. He ingeniously built networks of local informants who provided crucial reports on enemy movements, shrewdly recruited former Swedish soldiers who had been captured and subsequently released to furnish detailed intelligence about enemy camps, and regularly deployed Swedish cavalry units to conduct deep reconnaissance far beyond friendly lines. This invaluable intelligence allowed him to accurately anticipate enemy operations, position his limited forces with maximum advantage, and judiciously avoid battles where the circumstances were unfavorable for Swedish success. One specific, compelling example vividly illustrates how all these interconnected systems operated in concert. In September 1714, Fersen received critical intelligence indicating that a Saxon force of approximately 4,000 soldiers was advancing towards a Swedish-held town. Traditional military doctrine would have dictated defending the town with whatever forces were available. However, Finn's approach was fundamentally different. He shrewdly evacuated the town's Swedish garrison before the Saxons even arrived, making the settlement appear completely abandoned. When the Saxon forces subsequently occupied the town and dispersed to forage, Swedish cavalry units immediately struck their exposed supply trains. As the Saxons consolidated their forces to confront the cavalry threat, Swedish infantry ambushed their vulnerable foraging parties. When Saxon commanders finally managed to reassemble their scattered units and prepared to actively hunt down the Swedish forces, they found only empty positions and cold campfires. The Swedes had quietly withdrawn to new, prepared positions 20 miles away. The Saxons had indeed gained a town they had intended to capture anyway, but they had also lost over 300 soldiers to relentless Swedish attacks, severely depleted their own supplies trying to catch an elusive enemy that refused direct battle, and had effectively tied down 4,000 troops garrisoning a position that held no strategic value whatsoever. Meanwhile, Finn's forces remained entirely intact, poised and ready to repeat this training process whenever the next enemy column advanced. This was the very essence of his defensive method, to systematically trade seemingly worthless territory for immensely valuable enemy resources, making every single advance so costly that enemy commanders were forced to critically question whether continuing the offensive was truly worth the escalating price. The psychological dimension of this unique warfare was of equally paramount importance. Finn profoundly understood that military effectiveness extended far beyond mere weapons and tactics. It was intrinsically linked to morale, confidence, and the sheer will to continue fighting. His soldiers were acutely aware that they were severely outnumbered, that Sweden was undeniably losing the war, and that ultimate defeat was, in all likelihood, inevitable. Sustaining their fighting spirit under such profoundly discouraging circumstances necessitated providing them with victories, however small. Thus, Finn meticulously structured his operations to yield frequent, minor successes, successful ambushes, captured enemy supplies, isolated enemy detachments decisively defeated, all designed to powerfully reinforce the idea that Swedish soldiers remained inherently superior to their adversaries, irrespective of the daunting broader strategic situation. He also maintained an unflinching, brutal honesty about their desperate circumstances. While some commanders attempted to bolster morale through deceptive lies and false optimism, promising reinforcements that would never materialize and victories that were simply unattainable, Finn adopted the precise opposite approach. He candidly informed his soldiers exactly how desperate their situation truly was, precisely how unlikely their survival appeared, and yet, exactly why their continued resistance remained vitally important despite these stark realities. This profound honesty meticulously cultivated an unshakable trust. Soldiers knew unequivocally that their commander would never squander their precious lives on impossible missions simply to enhance his own image in reports to Stockholm. When Finn issued an order for an attack or a determined defensive stand, his soldiers trusted implicitly that there was a genuine, critical purpose behind that command. The officer corps that Finn painstakingly developed during these grueling campaigns merits particular attention. Many of these officers were once young men who had eagerly joined the Swedish army in the war's initial years, harboring expectations of swift glory and decisive victories. Instead, they had endured catastrophic defeat, relentless retreat, and the agonizingly slow collapse of Swedish military power. Lesser commanders would undoubtedly have witnessed these officers become demoralized and ultimately ineffective. However, Fersen, with his extraordinary leadership, forged them into arguably the finest junior leadership cadre in all of Europe. He achieved this remarkable feat through a powerful combination of practical, on-the-job education and radical delegation of authority. Junior officers within Finn's forces did not merely follow orders. They were empowered to make critical tactical decisions, command independent operations, and genuinely learn through direct experience rather than abstract classroom instruction. A young lieutenant, for instance, might find himself leading a raiding party deep into hostile enemy territory, forced to make life-or-death decisions without the presence of any senior officers. Surviving just a few of these high-stakes missions instilled a profound battlefield judgment that no amount of theoretical instruction could ever hope to provide. Finn furthermore shielded his officers from the kind of demoralizing scapegoating that frequently plagued losing armies. When operations failed, he steadfastly accepted full responsibility himself, rather than unjustly blaming his subordinates. Conversely, when operations succeeded, he generously credited the officers who had brilliantly executed them. This consistent behavior fostered an unshakable bond of loyalty and profound mutual respect. Officers knew with certainty that their commander would support them, would fiercely defend them against criticism from higher authority, and would meticulously preserve their reputations even when his own was at stake. The personal cost of this demanding command style was, without question, enormous. Finn lived under a perpetual cloud of intense stress, acutely aware that every single tactical decision he made possessed the power to either save or condemn the soldiers who had placed their absolute trust in him. He suffered from chronic sleep deprivation, often reviewing intricate battle plans and contingencies late into the night. He aged visibly during the grueling Pomeranian campaigns, his hair rapidly graying and his face developing the deep, etched lines that bore witness to years of crushing responsibility and insufficient rest. His subordinates observed that he laughed less as the war dragged on, and that the easy confidence characteristic of his early career had given way to a grim, resolute determination. His personal correspondence from this tumultuous period offers a poignant glimpse into his profound internal struggle. Letters to his wife, meticulously preserved and later analyzed by military historians, reveal a man agonizingly torn between unwavering duty and profound despair. He wrote extensively about the soldiers who perished under his command, young men whose names he remembered individually, and whose deaths he felt personally responsible for. He wrestled with fundamental questions, pondering whether continued resistance amounted to murder or upheld honor, and whether preserving Swedish military tradition truly justified the ever-mounting casualties. Yet he also articulated compelling reasons for his continued, arduous fight. He felt that surrender would be an unforgivable betrayal. He believed someone had to steadfastly hold the line, and most importantly, he was convinced that Swedish soldiers deserved commanders who would never abandon them to merely save their own lives. The relationship between Fenn and King Charles XII during this period was inherently complex and frequently fraught with tension. The king epitomized the heroic ideal of Swedish warfare, aggressive, supremely confident, always actively seeking battle, and firmly believing that superior tactics could inevitably overcome any numerical disadvantage. Fenn, in stark contrast, represented a grim, pragmatic reality, cautious, meticulously calculating, and possessing a profound understanding that tactics alone could never fully compensate for truly overwhelming enemy superiority. When they inevitably disagreed about strategy, which they frequently did, it transcended mere professional differences. It represented a fundamental disagreement concerning what Swedish military honor truly demanded. Charles XII viewed defensive warfare as inherently shameful, a profound betrayal of Carolean traditions that emphatically emphasized attack and aggressive offensive operations. Fersen, conversely, perceived it as an essential adaptation, a crucial means of preserving Swedish military capability when offensive operations would merely result in its needless waste. The king held fast to the belief that one more great victory could yet salvage the dire strategic situation. Fenn, however, knew with absolute certainty that even a grand victory would only serve to temporarily delay an inevitable defeat, while simultaneously costing irreplaceable Swedish lives. These were not disagreements that could ever be resolved through simple discussion. They profoundly reflected divergent worldviews about the very nature of war, the essence of honor, and the intricate relationship between tactical skill and strategic reality. Yet, despite these deep-seated tensions, Fenn never once publicly criticized the king. In council meetings, he consistently presented his professional military assessment, but accepted royal decisions without complaint. In correspondence with other Swedish commanders, he steadfastly defended Charles XII's strategic choices, even when he privately held strong disagreements with them. This behavior was neither weakness nor cowardice. It was a profound recognition that the Swedish army desperately needed unity far more than it needed public disputes among its senior commanders. His personal doubts remained strictly private. His public loyalty remained absolute. The soldiers serving under Fenn's command developed their own distinct and deeply ingrained culture throughout these arduous campaigns. They affectionately, if somewhat grimly, referred to themselves as the last Carolins, a half-joking, half-serious acknowledgement that they were likely the final generation to fight in the storied tradition established by Charles I. They developed a unique array of superstitions and rituals surrounding combat, lucky items carefully carried into battle, specific prayers recited before engagements, and rousing ceremonial drinking songs sung after successful operations. These practices were not official military traditions. Rather, they were organic developments born from men who regularly confronted death and desperately needed psychological anchors to sustain their courage. Furthermore, they cultivated an incredibly fierce unit loyalty. Soldiers who had fought side by side through multiple grueling campaigns, who had survived terrifying ambushes, protracted sieges, and desperate, chaotic retreats, formed bonds that often surpassed the ties of blood and kinship. This had tangible military advantages. Troops were demonstrably more willing to fight with fierce determination to shield their beloved comrades than to simply fulfill abstract strategic directives. Conversely, this deep emotional investment meant that casualties struck with a far greater, more devastating impact. The loss of a friend in the throes of combat transcended a mere tactical reversal. It inflicted a profound, personal grief that steadily compounded over years of relentless warfare. Finn acutely grasped this dynamic, seamlessly integrating it into his distinctive leadership philosophy. He made it a point to know his soldiers by name, retained intimate details about their families, and unfailingly attended funeral services for fallen troops, even when the relentless pressures of operational demands rendered such gestures incredibly challenging. This was not a calculated act of manipulation, though it undoubtedly boosted morale. Rather, it stemmed from a genuine and profound empathy for the men whose lives he was entrusted to lead. He regarded them as individual human beings, not mere military assets, and accorded them treatment that reflected this perspective, even when strict tactical efficiency might have dictated a more detached approach. The year 1720, marking the culmination of Finn's active campaigning, serves as a quintessential encapsulation of his entire distinguished career. At this juncture, it was universally understood that the protracted conflict was drawing to a close, with formal peace negotiations already well underway. Sweden had reluctantly reconciled itself to the impending loss of the majority of its empire. Nevertheless, Russian forces persisted in their military operations, aggressively seizing additional territories to bolster their leverage at the negotiating table. Finn found himself commanding Swedish forces, valiantly striving to thwart these last-minute territorial grabs, engaging in battles that, while strategically insignificant in the broader scope of the war, nonetheless held considerable weight for the ultimate terms of peace. In July of 1720, a formidable Russian force successfully landed on Sweden's eastern coast, posing an immediate and credible threat to raid inland settlements. Finn was entrusted with commanding the defensive contingent dispatched to repel this invasion, facing an estimated 3,000 Russians with only approximately 1,200 of his own soldiers. Conventional military wisdom dictated a tactical withdrawal, preserving his smaller force while reluctantly ceding these coastal areas to the anticipated raids. Finn, however, opted for a decisive counterattack. The ensuing engagement vividly showcased the profound culmination of everything he had assimilated over 15 arduous years of warfare. Swedish forces executed a stealthy advance under the cloak of darkness, achieving complete tactical surprise as they launched a devastating strike on the Russian beachhead at the break of dawn. The assault was executed with flawless coordination, with infantry simultaneously assailing Russian defensive positions from multiple converging angles, while cavalry deftly maneuvered to launch a flanking attack from the rear. Caught entirely off guard and utterly unable to mount any coherent resistance, the Russian forces swiftly broke ranks and fled in disarray back to their waiting ships. Swedish casualties amounted to a mere 37 men, while the Russians suffered over 400 killed or captured, in addition to the complete loss of the supplies and equipment they had brought for their intended inland raiding. In the grand tapestry of the war, it was a relatively minor engagement, scarcely warranting a mention in most historical accounts. Yet, it stood as a tactically flawless operation, a masterclass demonstrating how a numerically inferior force could decisively vanquish a superior opponent through meticulous planning, exceptional execution, and aggressive initiative. Moreover, it was Finn's final battle, a truly fitting conclusion to a career distinguished by his consistent ability to render the seemingly impossible a routine achievement. He achieved victory when it appeared utterly unattainable, powerfully demonstrating that Swedish military excellence resided not merely in numbers or resources, but in skill and determination. When the Treaty of Nystad ultimately brought the Great Northern War to its conclusion in 1721, Finn was present at the formal ceremonies held in Stockholm. He stood stoically among his fellow Swedish generals, listening intently as the harsh peace terms irrevocably confirmed Sweden's profound loss of empire. The Baltic provinces were ceded to Russia. Pomerania was relinquished to Prussia and Saxony. And Sweden's once unquestioned status as a great European power was relegated to the annals of history. Younger officers openly wept, overcome by what they perceived as an unbearable national humiliation. Finn, however, remained dry-eyed. For years he had understood that this outcome was inevitable. His entire career had been a relentless struggle to secure the best possible resolution from an unavoidable defeat. The peace terms were undeniably harsh, yet they were not catastrophic. Sweden had survived. For Finn, that was enough. His formal retirement from active service unequivocally marked the close of a distinct and significant era. The formidable Caroline military tradition, which had profoundly shaped Swedish military culture for many decades, effectively faded with his generation. Subsequent Swedish forces would necessarily be smaller, adopting a more defensive posture, their primary focus shifting to the protection of homeland territory rather than the projection of power across the European continent. The era of Swedish military dominance had unequivocally concluded, succeeded by a policy of cautious neutrality and meticulously orchestrated diplomacy. While some historians interpret this transition as a decline, a precipitous fall from a bygone greatness, Finn himself perceived it as a vital and necessary adaptation to drastically altered geopolitical circumstances. Great powers invariably rise and fall. Truly wise nations recognize when their period of dominance has reached its zenith and adapt their strategies accordingly. During his retirement, Finn dedicated his time to writing, though his output was decidedly not the triumphal, self-aggrandizing memoirs typically authored by successful generals. Instead, his prolific writings comprised rigorous technical analyses of defensive warfare, detailed tactical manuals on effective resistance for inferior forces against superior ones, and astute strategic assessments outlining the critical lessons Sweden ought to glean from the Great Northern War. He conspicuously avoided glorifying his personal accomplishments, or romanticizing the battles he had painstakingly fought. Instead, he penned his thoughts with clinical precision, dissecting what had proven effective, what had demonstrably failed, and what future Swedish commanders absolutely needed to comprehend about the stark realities of modern warfare. These incisive writings did not achieve widespread readership during his lifetime. The advent of peace naturally translated into diminished public interest in military matters, and Finn's pragmatic defensive focus largely failed to resonate with the prevailing Swedish cultural preferences for offensive glory. However, in subsequent eras, discerning military thinkers rediscovered his profound work, recognizing that he had articulated timeless principles of defensive warfare that retained their critical relevance long after the specific engagements he had fought had faded from popular memory. His groundbreaking analyses detailed how to strategically trade space for time, how to effectively preserve one's forces while systematically attriting enemy armies, and how to steadfastly maintain morale during a strategic retreat. These invaluable insights profoundly influenced military thinking well into the modern era. Furthermore, he dedicated himself to mentoring younger officers, imparting to the next generation of Swedish military leadership not grandiose strategic visions of conquering vast empires, but rather the essential, practical skills of judiciously managing limited resources, maintaining unwavering discipline under immense pressure, and a deep understanding that true military excellence was not merely about securing glorious victories, but about serving one's nation as effectively and competently as possible, given the specific, often challenging, circumstances one faced. Some of these dedicated students went on to forge distinguished careers, albeit within the context of the smaller-scale military operations that came to characterize Sweden's post-imperial era. They steadfastly carried forward Finn's profound emphasis on tactical excellence, unwavering professional competence, and principled, ethical leadership. His passing in 1740 transpired with surprisingly minimal public notice. There was no state funeral, no grand ceremonies, no widespread outpouring of national grief. He had, in essence, outlived his own era, becoming a somewhat anachronistic relic of a devastating war that most Swedes were eager to consign to oblivion. The obituaries published were notably brief and factual, simply acknowledging his military service without elaborating on specific achievements or details. For a man who had commanded armies, courageously repelled enemy invasions, and diligently preserved Swedish military capability during its darkest hour, it was a remarkably quiet and understated end. Yet, within discerning military circles, amongst professional soldiers who profoundly understood the true weight of his accomplishments, Finn's death was acknowledged with a deep and genuine sense of respect. These dedicated men were acutely aware of the exorbitant human cost of defensive warfare, the immense difficulty of fighting brilliantly even in the face of inevitable defeat, and the extreme rarity of commanders who prioritized preserving their soldiers' lives over squandering them in pursuit of fleeting, pointless glory. They unanimously recognized Finn as one of the most exemplary defensive commanders in the annals of European history, a general whose undeniable tactical brilliance had, regrettably, been overshadowed by the larger strategic defeat that even his genius could not avert. Indeed, modern military historians, when meticulously studying the evolution of defensive warfare, consistently place Finn among history's truly great defensive commanders. His masterful Pomeranian campaigns are rigorously analyzed in military academies worldwide. His groundbreaking tactical innovations continue to be studied intently by officers learning how to wage effective warfare with limited resources against numerically or materially superior adversaries. While the specific battles he fought may have faded from popular historical memory, his ingenious methods, a sophisticated synthesis of mobile defense, aggressive raiding, meticulous resource management, and unparalleled tactical excellence, profoundly influenced military thinking for countless generations. Ultimately, what renders Finn's story so profoundly compelling is not merely his tactical brilliance, however impressive it undeniably was. Rather, it is his unwavering moral courage, his resolute willingness to engage in impossible battles, fully cognizant of their inherent impossibility, and his unyielding commitment to duty, even when that duty entailed preserving what could be salvaged rather than striving for unattainable glory. In an era that lavishly celebrated heroic victory, he singularly mastered the art of heroic defeat. Within a military culture that highly prized offensive aggression, he perfected the nuanced discipline of defensive excellence. And in a military tradition fundamentally predicated on numerical superiority and the shock of overwhelming force, he unequivocally demonstrated that superior skill and unwavering determination could profoundly compensate for even the most daunting numerical disadvantages. His enduring legacy persists not in imposing monuments or grand, public memorials, but rather in the very bedrock of professional military standards and excellence. This includes the fundamental idea that commanders bear profound responsibility for the lives of their soldiers, beyond their mere tactical deployment. It encompasses the understanding that defensive operations demand just as much skill, if not more, than offensive ones. And it embodies the recognition that strategic defeat never excuses tactical incompetence, and that professional military excellence remains paramount, regardless of whether ultimate victory is attainable. These profound principles, which Finn meticulously exemplified throughout his entire illustrious career, remain utterly fundamental to the very definition of military professionalism. Consider, for a moment, the immense weight of what it truly meant to be Axel von Fersen during those harrowing final Pomeranian years. To command forces you knew, deep down, were ultimately doomed. To engage in battles you were acutely aware would inevitably be lost. To helplessly witness your soldiers sacrificing their lives for objectives that were simply beyond reach. To faithfully serve a king whose strategic vision you privately harbored grave doubts about. And crucially, to maintain impeccable professional standards and personal honor when both seemed utterly pointless in the face of insurmountable odds. Lesser men, in such dire circumstances, would undoubtedly have surrendered, fled, or simply ceased to care. Finn, however, fought on, not because he harbored any false hopes of victory, but because unwavering duty relentlessly demanded it, because his soldiers undeniably deserved competent and steadfast leadership, and because the venerable Swedish military tradition imperatively required excellence, irrespective of the prevailing, often grim, circumstances. This, in its purest essence, is the very definition of military professionalism, executing your duty superbly even when that duty is fraught with immense difficulty, steadfastly maintaining high standards even when those standards appear utterly irrelevant, and serving your nation with unwavering faithfulness, even when that service ultimately brings no glory and culminates in apparent defeat. Von epitomized these profound values throughout his entire career. He never achieved the sweeping, glorious victories that elevate commanders to legendary fame. He never led triumphant campaigns that dramatically altered the course of history. Instead, he simply fought with every ounce of humanly possible skill and determination, given the incredibly challenging circumstances he confronted, diligently preserved whatever could possibly be salvaged, and meticulously upheld Swedish military honor when honor was quite literally all that remained. Welcome to Sweden History, where we meticulously uncover the often forgotten stories that profoundly shaped the very fabric of Swedish military tradition. Axel von Fersen the Elder never attained the widespread fame or celebratory recognition of figures like Charles XII or Gustavus Adolphus. His arduous campaigns were not immortalized in stirring poems or grand paintings. Instead, he fought primarily defensive battles that popular history has, for the most part, largely overlooked. Yet, he fundamentally represented something utterly essential about true Swedish military excellence: the remarkable ability to fight brilliantly and effectively regardless of the most adverse circumstances, to steadfastly maintain unwavering competence under immense pressure, and to diligently preserve what truly mattered, even when ultimate victory was an impossibility. If you found Fon's story compelling, be assured there are dozens more just like it. Tales of Swedish commanders who achieved remarkable feats in seemingly impossible situations, whose tactical genius absolutely deserves wider recognition, and whose vital stories we are committed to meticulously recounting. This is Sweden History, dedicated to preserving the enduring legacy of those who so valiantly preserved Sweden itself.